The diplomatic stage was meticulously set. In neutral territory, negotiators had gathered to attempt the impossible, drafting a comprehensive framework to contain one of the most volatile geopolitical flashpoints on the planet. The protocols were agreed upon. The back-channel communications had paved the way. And then, with a single, highly calibrated statement, former President Trump threatened the very foundation of the Iranian regime. To the casual observer, it looked like political theater, a disruptive interjection designed to grab headlines on the very day negotiations were supposed to begin. But in the world of geopolitical intelligence, nothing is accidental. What happened wasn't just a threat. It was the exposure of a massive structural fault line beneath the entire diplomatic process. The deal isn't just in jeopardy. The deal was built on a premise that is rapidly disintegrating in real time. Because while diplomats focus on sanctions relief and enrichment caps, the underlying power dynamics of the Middle East have fundamentally shifted. And the real story isn't whether the deal survives the week. The real story is what happens when the negotiations collapse entirely, and the shadow war becomes the only option left on the table. To understand why this specific threat carries so much weight, we have to dismantle the architecture of the negotiations themselves. For years, the international community has approached the Iranian nuclear portfolio as a transactional problem, trade economic relief for verifiable restrictions on uranium enrichment. This is the Western diplomatic model. It assumes that all state actors behave as rational economic agents, that the prospect of integrating into the global financial system is enough to alter a nation's core strategic imperatives. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the true power center in Tehran, does not operate on Western economic logic. To the IRGC, the nuclear program is not a bargaining chip to be traded for GDP growth. It is the ultimate insurance policy for regime survival. It is the umbrella under which their vast network of proxy militias, stretching from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen, can operate with impunity. The negotiations were always attempting to treat a symptom while ignoring the disease. The deal sought to delay the nuclear timeline without addressing the ballistic missile program or the regional proxy network that Iran uses to project power across the Middle East. And this is precisely the fault line that Trump's statement targeted. By threatening Iran on the very day the talks began, the message wasn't aimed at the diplomats in the room. It was aimed directly at the regime's leadership, bypassing the entire framework of the negotiations. When you analyze the wording and the timing of the threat, a distinct strategic calculation emerges. This is the doctrine of maximum pressure, resurrected and applied at the point of maximum diplomatic vulnerability. The logic behind this approach is ruthless but clear. The architects of maximum pressure believe that the Iranian regime only responds to one variable, the credible threat of overwhelming force and absolute economic strangulation. They argue that offering concessions at the negotiating table signals weakness, and that weakness inevitably invites aggression. By injecting a highly visible, highly credible threat into the information space on the day of the negotiations, the strategic calculus for Iran changes instantly. It forces the Iranian delegation to look over the shoulders of the European and American diplomats sitting across from them and reckon with a potential future where the diplomatic off-ramp is permanently closed. This creates immense internal pressure within Tehran. The hardliners, who have always viewed negotiations with the West as a trap, use the threat as validation. They argue that the West cannot be trusted, that the deal is a temporary illusion, and that the only path forward is to accelerate enrichment and harden their underground facilities. Meanwhile, the pragmatists within the Iranian government, who desperately need sanctions relief to stave off domestic economic collapse, find their position fundamentally undermined. What do you think is the real reason behind the timing of this threat? Was it designed to strengthen the negotiating position or to intentionally collapse the talks before they even began? Let me know your perspective in the comments below. To truly decode the implications of this disruption, we must view it from the perspective of the Supreme Leader and the IRGC High Command. In Tehran, survival is the only metric that matters. Over the past decade, the regime has endured crippling sanctions, widespread domestic unrest, and targeted covert operations against its nuclear scientists and military commanders. They have learned to absorb immense pain and adapt. Their current strategy is known as resistance economics, combined with forward defense. They have built a sophisticated shadow economy to bypass Western financial networks, relying heavily on illicit oil sales to China. At the same time, they have armed and financed proxy forces across the region, creating a ring of fire around their adversaries to ensure that any direct conflict with Iran would immediately trigger a chaotic, multi-front regional war. When the Iranian leadership hears a threat from Trump on the day of negotiations, they do not panic. They calculate. They understand the fragility of the Western political cycle. They know that a deal signed by one administration can be unceremoniously shredded by the next. Therefore, their participation in the negotiations is highly tactical. They are not looking for a permanent reset of relations. They are looking for immediate sanctions relief to recapitalize their proxy networks while maintaining enough nuclear infrastructure to restart the program the moment the deal inevitably collapses. The threat serves as a stark reminder of their ultimate vulnerability. It reinforces their core belief that true security cannot be negotiated. It can only be built deep underground in fortified bunkers like Fordo and Natanz. While the diplomats argue over centrifuge cascades and verification protocols, the actual balance of power is being decided on the ground, across a geographic fault line that spans thousands of miles. The true nature of this conflict is not a piece of paper in Vienna or Geneva. It is the movement of advanced precision-guided munitions through the deserts of Iraq and into the mountains of Syria and Lebanon. It is the continued disruption of global shipping lanes in the Red Sea. It is the constant, low-intensity warfare between Israeli intelligence and IRGC operatives playing out in the shadows. If you are finding this analysis of the strategic realities beneath the headlines valuable, take a second to hit the like button. It helps push this kind of deep geopolitical intelligence to an audience that actually wants to understand the world. The negotiations were an attempt to put a lid on this boiling cauldron, but the threat exposed the reality that the lid is already blowing off. Israel, for its part, has made it abundantly clear that they will not be bound by any diplomatic agreement that leaves Iran as a threshold nuclear state. The Israeli military has been accelerating its preparations for a unilateral strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, a scenario that would instantly ignite the entire region. The campaign between the wars is evolving into a more direct, overt confrontation. When the threat was issued, it wasn't just words. It was backed by the implicit understanding that regional actors are already positioning their military assets for the failure of diplomacy. The collapse of these negotiations wouldn't just be a regional crisis. It would trigger a massive realignment of global superpower dynamics. We are no longer living in a unipolar world where the United States can unilaterally dictate the terms of global security. The fault lines have shifted. As Western pressure mounts, Iran has aggressively pivoted east. They have signed long-term strategic and economic partnerships with China, securing a vital lifeline for their oil exports. Furthermore, they have become a crucial military supplier to Russia, providing thousands of loitering munitions and ballistic missiles that have fundamentally altered the battlefield dynamics in Eastern Europe. This integration into an anti-Western geopolitical bloc provides Iran with a strategic depth they have never possessed before. It means that any attempt to isolate Tehran economically or militarily will be directly countered by Moscow and Beijing. When Trump issues a threat on the day of negotiations, the ripple effects are felt immediately in the Kremlin and Zhongnanhai. To Russia and China, a hostile, isolated Iran is a highly useful strategic asset, a constant thorn in the side of the West that forces the United States to expend enormous resources and political capital in the Middle East, distracting them from the primary theaters of competition in the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe. The negotiations were the last fragile thread keeping Iran tethered to the possibility of Western integration. If that thread snaps, the division of the world into competing heavily armed blocs will accelerate exponentially. Do you believe a military confrontation is inevitable if the diplomatic route completely fails? Or is a long-term strategy of containment the only realistic option left? Drop your thoughts down below. So, what happens now? Is the deal entirely in jeopardy? The short answer is yes, but the long answer is that the deal was likely a walking corpse before the negotiators even sat down. The threat simply stripped away the illusion of diplomatic progress. It forced all parties to confront the reality that the core strategic objectives of the United States, Israel, and Iran are fundamentally, structurally incompatible. No amount of diplomatic maneuvering can reconcile the fact that Iran's requirement for survival, a threshold nuclear capability and regional proxy dominance, is the exact scenario that the U.S. and its allies consider an existential threat. As the possibility of a comprehensive agreement fades, we are entering a highly volatile period of asymmetric escalation. We will see an increase in covert operations. Cyber warfare targeting critical infrastructure will become more aggressive. The proxy militias in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen will test the red lines of Western resolve with deniable strikes. And Iran will continue its strategy of nuclear extortion, slowly, deliberately, creeping closer to weapons-grade enrichment, calculating exactly how far they can push the boundaries without triggering a preemptive military strike. They are playing a dangerous game of geopolitical chicken, assuming that the West lacks the political appetite for another massive conflict in the Middle East. The world doesn't break without warning. The fault lines are always there, building pressure invisibly until the moment of rupture. The threat delivered on the day of the negotiations wasn't the cause of the breakdown. It was the seismic indicator of the pressure building beneath the surface. It revealed that the era of containing the Iranian challenge through purely diplomatic and economic means is rapidly coming to an end. We are shifting into a new paradigm, one where deterrence must be re-established through hard power, where the shadow war steps into the light, and where the decisions made in the coming months will dictate the security architecture of the Middle East for the next generation. If you want to understand these shifting global dynamics, if you are tired of surface-level news and want the actual strategic intelligence behind the headlines, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Here at Fault Lines, we map the fractures before they break. The negotiations may have been the focal point for the cameras, but the real decisions are already being made in the war rooms and underground bunkers. The diplomatic window is closing. The period of consequence has begun. I'll see you in the next briefing.